Welcome to today's screencast. Unit 1, Anatomy and Physiology. Section 2, Muscle Types. Okay, so today's screencast is really going to focus on not only the muscle types, but also their structure and the linking that to their function. And this is really important for understanding the merit and distinction criteria. So there are three types of muscle in the human body. We've got cardiac muscle, which is only found in the heart. We've got smooth muscle, which is found inside hollow organs, such as arteries or intestines. And then we've also got skeletal muscle, which are the muscles that we need to move. Let's have a look at each of those in a little bit more detail. So firstly, cardiac muscle. If we look at some of the cardiac muscle structure under a microscope, we can see some very important traits. Firstly, we can see that they contain stripy bands, which are known as striations. And these bands of light and dark represent two very important elements, which we'll discuss in a second. The fibres also branch and connect to each other, so you'll see that they sort of form a Y pattern as they link to each other. Cardiac muscle is also really special because it can generate its own beat, which is called being myogenic. So that was very much a past description, but in order to achieve merit and distinction, we need to be able to explain why. Why is it that the heart tissue is structured in that way? So, firstly, striations. Why are they striated? Well, cardiac muscle contains striations because they contain these actin and myosin filaments. Now, actin and myosin are molecular compounds that actually produce the movement. And it's this movement that's very strong and very powerful, which is what the heart needs to pump blood. So this is why it has actin and myosin, and this is why we see striations. We just see the actin and the myosin. The reasons that the fibres branch and connect to one another means that when the muscle tissue is stimulated, that nerve impulse can pass through the muscle fibres very quickly because it can jump between fibre to fibre. And this allows huge sections of the heart to contract all at once. And this is really how your heart works. It does contract all at once. So for example, on the screen in front of you, you can see the heart beating. The top half of the part all needs to contract at once, and it does so quite easily. The heart is also myogenic, and this means that the contraction is involuntary. It means it's stimulated by a certain part of the brain called the automatic nervous system, or ANS. So our brain is in control of it, but actually we're not really thinking about it, which is quite useful because if we were sleeping or doing exercise, we wouldn't want to have to think about actually beating our heart. Our brain just does it for us. Another really good fact about the cardiac muscle is that it doesn't actually fatigue. So unlike skeletal muscle, which does fatigue, cardiac muscle does not. And it's really important for us to understand why. Why is it that cardiac muscle can do that? Well, it all comes down to what is inside cardiac muscle. Now, cardiac muscle actually contains a huge amount of mitochondria and myoglobin. Now, mitochondria are these little organelles that are inside the muscle cells, and these turn oxygen into energy. Because we've got a huge amount of those, we're able to generate a huge amount of energy. We also have myoglobin, which is our body's reserve store of oxygen. So if we can't get oxygen into the body, we've got some backed up ready. The cardiac muscle also has an amazing blood supply. You may have heard of the coronary artery, and there are two coronary arteries in the heart. These siphon blood that's coming into the heart from the lungs, so it's rich in oxygen, and it provides the muscle tissue with this oxygen. So you can see by getting a huge amount of blood supply, the heart is able to get a huge amount of oxygen into the tissue, ready to be converted into energy with mitochondria. So to put all that together, imagine that the heart is a supercar. Now, if you were building a supercar, you'd want your supercar to have a big fuel supply. Well, the heart has that because it has a large coronary blood supply. So there's constantly oxygen arriving in the heart tissue ready to be turned into energy. You'd also want your car to have a big engine. Well, Cardiac tissue also has this because it has a large amount of mitochondria. So once the oxygen arrives in the heart tissue, we have a large amount of mitochondria to turn that oxygen into energy. And of course, if for some reason we can't get enough oxygen into our bodies, we have a big fuel reserve, and that is in the form of the myoglobin. So hopefully this starts to explain why cardiac muscle tissue is able to beat continuously every day without getting tired. Okay, so let's move on to skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle is actually very similar to cardiac muscle. It's striated, so it has those stripy bands under a microscope. And of course this is because of the actin and myosin. And it also has tubular-shaped muscle cells, which again is similar to how the cardiac muscle is arranged. But again, we need to try and think about why. Why is skeletal muscle structured in this way? So, why has it got striations? Well, this again is because it has actin and myosin, and it's these two molecular compounds that are needed in order for strong, powerful contractions. And of course, this is what we need with skeletal muscle. We also need our skeletal muscle to be elastic, just like cardiac muscle. So once we have put the muscle under tension, when we release it, it will go back to as it was. Another very useful property of skeletal muscle. However, there are some differences with cardiac muscle. One difference is that skeletal muscle is voluntary. Now, this means that we can choose to move the muscles when we need to. So, why is this? Well, again, we use the brain to use the muscles, but unlike the heart, we use a different part of the brain. This time we use the central nervous system, or the CNS. And this part of the brain tells our muscles, our skeletal muscles, to move when we need them. But of course, we actually consciously control that. If this didn't happen, then we'd be a bit like a robot. Our brain would make our decision for us, and we wouldn't be able to consciously choose whether to move our muscles. And this obviously is quite handy because it allows us total control over how we move. Another big difference compared to cardiac muscle is that skeletal muscle is arranged into bundles. Now what this means is that if we want to make a small movement, like for example clicking a mouse, we only recruit the amount of muscle that we need in order to perform the movement. So for a mouse click, we'd only recruit a few fibres in our hands. However, if we were doing a large movement, like lifting weights, we could recruit more of them. Now this is quite important because, of course, as you remember, in cardiac muscle, the whole muscle is contracted in one go. We can't pick and choose how much of it we want to contract. And that's because the cardiac muscle fibres are branched. Skeletal muscle fibres are not. So, of course, just to reiterate that again, if we want to lift a weight, a very heavy weight, we can choose to recruit all of our muscle fibres, whereas if we just wanted to lift something small, like a frying pan, we would only recruit a few of those fibres. And that's a really big part of skeletal muscle and why that's different to cardiac muscle. Another reason, of course, is that unlike cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle is generally always connected to a bone. And it's by pulling on those bones that we produce movement. Okay, so the last muscle type to discuss is smooth muscle. Now, smooth muscle cells are shaped in a fusiform shape, which looks like this. And these cells are then arranged on top of each other to form sheets of muscle. So they're very different in shape and size compared to skeletal and cardiac muscle tissue cells. Another big difference is that smooth muscle is not connected to any bone. It's arranged in sheets and generally features on the inside of hollow organs. So for example, here is a cross-section of an artery, and you can see here the light pink layer is the muscular wall that surrounds the artery, and that allows the artery to contract and squeeze blood through. But it does have some similarities. So smooth muscle, for example, is again involuntary, which means that we can stimulate a part of the brain to send neurogenic impulses to the smooth muscle and tell it to contract. We don't have to think about digesting our food, our body does it for us. Of course, this is great because what it means is these slow, rhythmical contractions take place without us even realizing. One big difference with smooth muscle is that it's not striated, so it doesn't have those stripy bands. And of course, this is because it doesn't have any actin or myosin in it. Now, you'll remember from the previous discussion, actin and myosin are needed to produce powerful contractions. So of course, because smooth muscle doesn't have these actin and myosin filaments, it can't produce strong, powerful contractions. And this is why smooth muscle contracts very slowly, which is why our food takes a while to get through. Now, this is quite useful. In the case of the intestines, our food needs to pass slowly so that we've got time to absorb the nutrients from the intestines. So actually it's handy having very slow contractions. So it contracts very differently to the other types of muscle. Because of the lack of actin and myosin, it's very slow, and it contracts in a process that's called peristalsis. Now, peristalsis is essentially where one part of the intestine or the artery contracts and it pushes the blood, or in this case, as the diagram shows, a bolus. A bolus is just a piece of food. So if we imagine this is our intestine, a small part of the intestine contracts and pushes the food down. As the food makes its way down, again the next part contracts, and it's sort of like in a wave motion. Okay, so we've been through all three muscle types. So what's really important is that you may be able to describe some of the structure of the three muscle types for a pass. But for merit, you need to explain why. So why is it that smooth muscle doesn't have striations? Why is it that the heart or cardiac tissue has a lot of mitochondria? So explaining why will get you a merit. For distinction, you then need to be able to compare and contrast. So compare the three types. You may find it easy to start off by drawing a table and then explaining why certain muscles or certain muscle types have certain things and certain muscle types do not.